Welcome to our channel, where stories help you relax and fall asleep. Get comfortable, listen, and don't forget to subscribe for more soothing bedtime tales. The sea was restless the night Napoleon Bonaparte was born. Waves crashed against the jagged Corsican coast as a warm wind blew through the narrow streets of Ajaccio. The people of the island said that when a child entered the world beneath such a storm, the gods were arguing over his fate. Inside a modest stone house, candles trembled in the draught. Letizia Ramolino, strong and silent, endured her labor without a cry. Her husband, Carlo Buonaparte, paced the corridor, his hands clasped behind his back, whispering prayers, half in Italian, half in French. When the child finally arrived, small, dark-eyed, his fists clenched, the priest waiting outside murmured, "He will make the world listen." They named him Napoleone di Bonaparte. And at that moment, no one could have imagined that the fragile infant would one day shake the foundations of Europe. Corsica was a land of stubborn men and harder stones. Its people lived between the sea and the mountains, proud of their independence, suspicious of outsiders, and bound by an honor that was both noble and dangerous. Napoleon grew up hearing tales of freedom and rebellion from his father, Carlo Buonaparte, a lawyer who had once served under the Corsican patriot Pasquale Paoli. The boy listened intently to stories of uprisings and lost battles. He learned early that freedom was not a gift but a wound, one that Corsicans carried like a badge. Yet even as he admired Paoli, the child felt a strange pull toward the new French rulers. He understood, even before most men did, that the world was changing. He was not made to be a rebel hiding in the mountains. He was made to command them. Brienne, the outsider. At the age of 9, Napoleon left Corsica for France, the enemy land that now called itself his home. His father, through connections and persistence, secured him a scholarship to the Royal Military School at Brienne-le-Château. There, among the sons of French nobles, the small dark-haired boy from Corsica was treated as an alien. They mocked his accent, his poor French, his provincial clothes. He was quick to anger, quicker to defend his pride. But he found solace where others saw tedium, in books, in solitude, in the geometry of war. He devoured the histories of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Hannibal. He learned the art of maneuver and strategy, not as theory, but as destiny. While others played, he studied. While they laughed, he plotted. In the quiet dormitory, he once wrote in his notebook, "Great ambition is the passion of a great character. Those endowed with it may perform very good or very bad acts. All depends on the principles which direct them." Already he felt something burning inside him, a cold fire, not of emotion, but of purpose. The making of a soldier. At 16, Napoleon graduated from the École Militaire in Paris and was commissioned as a second lieutenant of artillery. He was poor, proud, and utterly devoted to his craft. Artillery was not a glamorous branch, but it was a thinking man's weapon. Precise, mathematical, devastating. He treated each cannon as a chess piece, each trajectory as a line of logic. He learned to see the battlefield as a map of possibilities. But France was rotting from within. The monarchy teetered, the people starved, and revolution brewed like a storm over the horizon. Napoleon, ever the observer, watched and waited. He had no loyalty to kings or mobs, only to his own vision of order and greatness. In 1789, when the revolution finally tore through France, Napoleon was 20 years old. While Paris screamed for liberty and blood, he was back in Corsica, torn between his love for the island and his growing belief that destiny waited elsewhere. Dobur obcu aus the turning point, Toulon. In 1793, opportunity came with the thunder of cannons. The port city of Toulon had risen against the revolution and invited the British fleet to occupy its harbor. France's survival was at stake. The siege dragged on, confused, leaderless, hopeless, until a young artillery officer arrived with a plan. Napoleon's eyes scanned the terrain. He saw what others didn't. The key to Toulon lay in two small hills overlooking the harbor. Capture them, and the British fleet would have no choice but to flee. He presented his plan, demanded guns, men, and authority. Many laughed at the young Corsican's audacity, but when the cannons began to roar under his direction, laughter turned to awe. Within days, Toulon fell. The British retreated, the Republic was saved, and the name Bonaparte was whispered for the first time across France. His reward was promotion to brigadier general, and more intoxicatingly, power. Paris and ambition. The revolution devoured its own children. The guillotine worked day and night. Robespierre fell, and the nation bled from every wound. Yet in the chaos, Napoleon's star only rose. In 1795, Royalists attempted an uprising in Paris, the streets filled with armed mobs marching toward the National Convention. The government panicked, until someone remembered the young general who had saved Toulon. Napoleon arrived, surveyed the streets, and gave a single order: give them a whiff of grape shot. The cannons fired down the boulevards. The uprising died in a storm of smoke and screams. The city fell silent. The Republic was safe again, for now. In that silence, the Directory, the fragile government of post-revolutionary France, found its new protector. Napoleon, now only 26, was given command of the Army of Italy. He rode south with a worn uniform and eyes that no longer belonged to a mere man. Dacitin, the Italian lightning Italy, was beautiful and doomed. Its valleys were divided among Austrians, Piedmontese, and a dozen petty kingdoms. The French army that Napoleon inherited was starving, ragged, unpaid. His generals mocked him behind his back, but the first time he spoke to the soldiers, everything changed. "Soldiers," he said, "you are hungry and naked. The government owes you much, but can give you nothing. I will lead you into the most fertile plains of the world. There you will find honor, glory, and wealth." The men erupted in cheers. They did not yet believe in France, but they believed in him. Then came Montenotte, Millesimo, Mondovi, names that thundered across Europe. Napoleon divided his enemies, deceived their scouts, struck faster than any army could move. His victories were not mere battles. They were performances of genius. By the time he entered Milan, the soldiers who once mocked him now whispered his name like a prayer. The Italian campaign had turned the obscure Corsican into a continental legend. For the shadow of Egypt, but legends hunger for more. In 1798, Napoleon convinced the Directory to let him invade Egypt, not for conquest alone, but for glory, for mystery, for the echo of Alexander. He brought with him not only soldiers, but scientists, artists, and engineers. He sought to marry war and enlightenment, cannon and compass. Under the desert sun, pyramids loomed like silent judges. "Soldiers," he told his men before the Battle of the Pyramids, 40 centuries looked down upon you. They fought like immortals. But destiny, like the desert, is merciless. The British fleet under Admiral Nelson destroyed the French ships at Aboukir Bay. The army was stranded. The dream of empire dissolved in sand and blood. Napoleon left his men and slipped back to France. He arrived unannounced, yet the streets filled with cheers. France, exhausted by revolution, was ready for a savior. The seizure of power. On November 9, 1799, or, in revolutionary terms, the 18th of Brumaire, Napoleon entered the Council of 500. The deputies shouted, cursed, drew daggers. He stood calm amid the storm. "I have come," he said, "to save the Republic." Soldiers filled the hall. The deputies fled. And by evening, the Republic had been saved, by ending it. Napoleon Bonaparte, the artilleryman from Corsica, was now first consul of France. He had not merely climbed the ladder of history, he had thrown it away behind him. 1. The island and the fire Corsica, still scarred by war, had only recently fallen under French rule. The Bonapartes were minor nobles, proud, poor, and loyal to the dream of Corsican freedom. Carlo had once served under the great patriot Pasquale Paoli, whose rebellion against the Genoese and later against the French had failed. The child grew up among stories of resistance. His mother taught him faith and discipline. His father taught him pride. From the hills above Ajaccio, he would stare at the sea for hours, silent, as if trying to read his destiny in the horizon line. He was fierce even as a boy, quick to anger, quicker to dream. When other children quarreled, he commanded them. When they played war, he planned campaigns. At night, he listened to the waves and thought of heroes. 2. The outsider at Brienne. At 9 years old, Napoleon left the island for France. The journey was long and rough. The boy barely spoke the language of his new masters. Yet Carlo's ambition for his son was boundless. He believed education was the road from obscurity to greatness. The Royal Military School of Brienne-le-Château was a cold, grey fortress of learning. The young Corsican was mocked for his accent, his rough manners, his strange name. The little barbarian, the sons of nobles called him. He endured in silence, but every insult carved itself into his memory. Books became his refuge. He devoured Plutarch, Livy, Caesar. He studied geography until he could recite the rivers of Europe from memory. Mathematics fascinated him. The logic of angles, the certainty of artillery trajectories. One winter evening, after a cruel prank by his classmates, Napoleon wrote in his notebook, "I shall prove myself through deeds, not birth. The time will come when these will be ashamed." It was not childish anger, it was prophecy. 3. A soldier of France Paris, 1785. At 16, Napoleon graduated from the École Militaire, one of the youngest officers ever commissioned. He joined the artillery, the branch that required the keenest mind. France was still ruled by Louis XVI, yet the air of the capital smelled of change, pamphlets, coffee, ink, and discontent. Napoleon walked its streets unseen, absorbing everything. He spent his pay on books and maps, not wine or clothes. In his tiny apartment he wrote treatises on tactics, quoting Caesar and Polybius, sketching fortifications until dawn. He was an officer of a monarchy, but his loyalty already leaned toward ideas, efficiency, merit, order. When the revolution erupted in 1789, the world he served crumbled overnight. Many officers fled, others were executed. Napoleon watched, waiting, calculating. He understood chaos not as a threat but as opportunity. 4. Return to Corsica. The revolution spread even to Corsica. Paoli returned from exile, hailed once again as the island's father. Napoleon at first revered him, then quarreled bitterly with him. The old patriot wanted independence. Napoleon wanted unity under revolutionary France. The argument split families and friends. When fighting broke out, the Bonapartes were forced to flee their home. Their house in Ajaccio was burned. Homeless, exiled, they found refuge in Marseille. Poor refugees among thousands. For the young officer, humiliation turned into steel. He had lost his island, but in doing so, he had found his nation. He no longer signed his name Buonaparte. He became Bonaparte, a man of France. 5. Toulon, 1793. The first thunder France was at war with half of Europe and at war with itself. Royalist rebels in Toulon had invited the British fleet into the harbor. The city was lost, until a young captain of artillery arrived with a plan no one else could see. Napoleon studied the terrain for hours. He noted the position of every hill, every battery, every possible angle. Then he pointed at 2 small forts on a ridge overlooking the bay. "Take those," he said, "and we take Toulon." He demanded guns, men, and authority. Generals laughed at his arrogance until his cannons began to fire. The night the French tricolor rose above the captured forts, the harbor below erupted in flame. The British fleet sailed away under a sky lit by burning ships. The Republic was saved. At 24, Napoleon Bonaparte was a brigadier general. In Paris, men spoke his name with admiration. In London, with unease. 6. The Revolution turns dark. The reign of terror swept through France like a plague. Robespierre ruled with fear, and suspicion was enough for execution. Napoleon, pragmatic and cautious, kept silent. He studied politics as carefully as he once studied geometry. When Robespierre fell, the young general found himself unemployed, living on borrowed money, writing pamphlets on war, yet he never despaired. "A man worth something," he wrote, "never gives up. He bends events to his will." That chance came in October 1795. Royalists rose against the new government, marching on the National Convention. The city of Paris trembled. The government called for help, and someone remembered the artillery officer from Toulon. Napoleon arrived at dawn, calm, precise. He ordered cannons loaded with grape shot positioned along the streets. When the mob advanced, he gave the signal. A single volley of iron tore through the rebels. The uprising ended in minutes. The politicians called it a whiff of grape shot. The people called it salvation. The Directory rewarded him with command of the army of Italy. The nation had found its sword. 7. The Italian miracle. The army he inherited was starving, barefoot, and mutinous. When Napoleon rode out to address them, the soldiers watched the small, pale general with suspicion. He spoke simply. "Soldiers, you are hungry and naked. The government owes you much, but can give you nothing. I will lead you into the most fertile plains of the world. There you will find honor, glory, and wealth." The words lit fire in their hearts. In the spring of 1796, he unleashed a campaign of speed and precision never seen before. He split the Austrian and Piedmontese armies, struck where they were weakest, and always moved faster than they could react. At Montenotte, Millesimo, Lodi, names that became legend, he defeated enemies twice his number. The crossing of the bridge of Lodi was pure theatre. Under a storm of musket fire, Napoleon seized a flag, led the charge himself, and forced the passage. The soldiers who followed him called him the Little Corporal, not with mockery now, but with love. Within months, northern Italy lay at his feet. He entered Milan as a liberator. Citizens lined the streets, showering him with flowers. He wrote to the Directory, "In 15 days, we have won 6 victories, taken 21 colors, 55 guns, and conquered Lombardy." But privately, in his tent that night, he whispered to himself, "Italy is the beginning. There is more." 8. The vision. In the glow of candlelight, maps spread across his table, Napoleon saw not borders but possibilities. France could be more than a republic. It could be an empire of reason, law, and strength. His victories were not just battles. They were arguments made with gunpowder and will. At 27, he had become the most famous man in Europe. But fame was never his goal. Power was. He once wrote to Josephine, his new wife, "I love you, but I love glory even more." The stars above his camp flickered over the tents of an army that adored him. Somewhere in that darkness, the destiny of France was already turning toward a throne. The young general returned from Italy a legend. He was thin, pale, restless, but his eyes burned with the strange confidence of a man who had seen his own destiny and believed it inevitable. France adored him. Parisian crowds filled the streets to catch a glimpse of the conqueror of Italy. Women threw flowers at his feet. Men whispered that the revolution had finally found its Alexander. Yet the Directory, the weak government of lawyers and financiers, watched with unease. They had sent a boy to fight their wars, and he had returned a hero too powerful to control. 1. The seeds of Egypt Napoleon, always hungry for motion, soon grew bored with politics and ceremony. He wanted a new stage, a larger challenge. Europe, for the moment, was quiet. England remained untouchable behind its navy. So he proposed something audacious, to strike not at England itself, but at her empire. If we cannot reach London, he told the ministers, we will reach India through Egypt. The plan was half strategy, half dream. Egypt, land of pharaohs and sand, gateway between East and West. To conquer it was to link history's past with France's future. The Directory, eager to be rid of him, agreed. In May 1798, Napoleon sailed from Toulon with 35,000 men, soldiers, scientists, engineers, and artists. It was not merely an army, it was a civilization on the move. He told them, we are about to embark on the most important expedition ever undertaken. Soldiers, you will find their vast cities, magnificent monuments, and a people worthy of our attention. 2. The Pyramids and the Desert. The voyage was long and strange. They landed at Alexandria beneath a blinding sun. The desert stretched endless before them, a sea of silence and heat. Soon came their first trial, the Battle of the Pyramids. Facing the Mamluk cavalry, glittering in gold and silk, Napoleon formed his men into squares. From the height of these pyramids, he told them, 40 centuries look down upon you. The French guns roared. The Mamluks charged again and again. But discipline triumphed over fury. When the smoke cleared, the desert was littered with bodies and broken spears. Egypt was theirs, in name at least. But triumph turned hollow. The local people resisted. The sun killed more men than the sword. Then came the shattering news. Admiral Nelson had destroyed the French fleet at Abu Qir Bay. The army was stranded. Napoleon faced his first real prison, not of walls, but of geography. He explored Cairo, studied Islam, founded the Institute of Egypt, and dreamed of empire even in ruin. But he knew the desert had betrayed him. In 1799, leaving his men behind, he slipped back to France under cover of night. 3. The coup of Brumaire France had changed again. The Directory was despised, corruption everywhere, the treasury empty, the people exhausted. The revolution had devoured itself. When Napoleon stepped ashore, he was greeted not as a general, but as a savior. The politicians thought they could use his fame. He thought otherwise. On November 9, 1799, the 18th of Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar, soldiers loyal to him surrounded the legislature at Saint-Cloud. Deputies shouted, cursed, drew knives. Napoleon stood before them, pale and furious. "You are sitting on a volcano," he said. "France demands order." When the crowd lunged at him, his brother Lucien shouted to the guards, "The general is being attacked. Drive out these madmen." The soldiers obeyed. By nightfall, the chambers were empty, the Directory dissolved. France had traded chaos for command. Napoleon Bonaparte became first consul of the Republic, master in all but name. 4. The consul of order, he moved swiftly, like a man afraid that history might wake and stop him. In a few months, he rewrote the laws, stabilized the currency, rebuilt the schools, reopened the churches. Where the revolution had destroyed, he constructed. Where it had screamed of liberty, he whispered of stability. He worked endlessly, sleeping 4 hours, dictating letters before dawn, reviewing reports by candlelight. Ministers feared his glance. He remembered everything, forgave nothing. The people adored him. They did not crave ideology anymore. They craved peace. Foreign powers, astonished by the new France, hesitated. Napoleon struck again. In 1800 he crossed the Alps, not as a pilgrim, but as a storm. The passage was brutal. Snow, ice, exhaustion. Soldiers dragged cannons by ropes, horses slipped into ravines. Yet the image of their small general riding a white mule through the mountains burned into legend. On the plains beyond, he met the Austrians at Marengo. The battle began badly. By afternoon, the French were near collapse. Then Napoleon rallied his men, threw in his reserves, and turned defeat into dazzling victory. Europe understood. The miracle boy of Italy had returned, but now he was something more. He was the future itself. Peace and power. For the first time in decades, France knew peace. Trade returned, cities revived. Streets once filled with mobs now hummed with commerce. In 1801, he signed a concordat with the Pope, ending the war between the Church and the Revolution. In 1802, the people voted to make him consul for life. It was not tyranny, it was gratitude. Napoleon himself described it differently. I found the crown of France lying in the gutter, and I picked it up with my sword. He founded the Legion of Honor, the Bank of France, the Code Civil, the laws that still shape Europe 2 centuries later. But peace could not satisfy him. He was a creature of motion, of conquest, of destiny. Across the Channel, Britain armed again. Across the Rhine, monarchs plotted revenge. The Corsican boy looked in the mirror and saw an emperor. 46. The Coronation. The morning of December 6, 1804 was cold and brilliant. Inside Notre Dame, the air shimmered with gold. Nobles in silk, bishops in scarlet, marshals glittering with medals, all eyes on the man in white and crimson, the son of Corsica, standing before the Pope. Music swelled. Pius VII raised the crown. Then, with quiet audacity, Napoleon took it from his hands and placed it on his own head. A gasp ran through the crowd. Shock, awe, inevitability. Josephine knelt. He crowned her too, gently, almost tenderly. The organ thundered. Paris shook with cannon fire, announcing a new epoch. Napoleon Bonaparte, first consul of the Republic, had become Emperor of the French. He had not inherited the crown. He had seized it. 7. The awakening of Europe reacted like a wounded lion. Austria, Russia, and Britain formed the third coalition to crush him. Armies massed along the Rhine, certain that the upstart emperor would at last be destroyed. Napoleon's response was pure brilliance. The Grande Armée, camped at Boulogne for an invasion of England, suddenly pivoted east, a movement of 200,000 men executed with mechanical precision. They marched faster than news could travel, crossing rivers and mountains in silence. By the time the Austrians realized what was happening, they were surrounded at Ulm. General Mack, trapped without a battle, surrendered with 30,000 men. Napoleon watched the capitulation and murmured, "It is not by the sword alone that one conquers." From there he turned toward the Russian army gathering in Moravia. The stage was set for his masterpiece. 8. The son of Austerlitz. December 2, 1805, exactly 1 year since his coronation. Dawn crept over the frosted fields near Austerlitz. A thick mist hung low. The Allied forces, twice his size, moved to attack what they thought was his weakened right flank. Napoleon waited. He had invited the trap himself. When the enemy center left the Pratzen Heights undefended, he gave the order. "Soldiers, remember," he said, "your emperor is watching you." French columns emerged from the fog like ghosts, climbing the hill in perfect alignment. Sunlight broke through the clouds, later called the Sun of Austerlitz. Within hours, the Allied army was shattered. Thousands lay dead or drowned in the frozen lakes below. The Tsar fled. The Austrian emperor sued for peace. That night, Napoleon rode across the silent battlefield. He stopped his horse, looked over the wreckage, and whispered, "One sharp blow, and I have destroyed the coalition." Chapter 9. The Emperor's Dream. In Paris, bells rang, fireworks blazed. Europe lay at his feet. The map of the continent bent to his will. He created kingdoms for his brothers, thrones for his generals, laws for nations that had never known order. From Lisbon to Warsaw, his code replaced chaos. His eagles flew across the Alps, the Danube, the Rhine. He dreamed of a Europe united under reason. And under him. At his side, Josephine smiled for the crowds, but wept in private. Their love, once burning, had cooled under the weight of power. He needed an heir. She could not give one. He was emperor now, but increasingly alone. His enemies called him tyrant. His soldiers called him father. Somewhere deep within, he still heard the waves of Corsica, the whisper that had called him to greatness. And he wondered if it would ever let him rest. The winter after Austerlitz was a season of triumph. In Paris, theaters played songs of victory. Tailors sold Austerlitz grey coats. Children drew eagles in chalk upon the stones. France no longer bowed to kings. Kings bowed to France. But to Napoleon, triumph was only proof that the next triumph was possible. He worked like a machine of thought, rarely sleeping, dictating letters to 3 secretaries at once. He read every report, decided every budget, signed every commission. He was not ruling a country. He was commanding it. 1. The War of Kings Prussia, proud and wounded, could not endure the humiliation of watching Austria's defeat. Its young nobles shouted for revenge, dreaming of Frederick the Great's ghosts riding again. In the autumn of 1806, the Prussian army, 200,000 strong, marched toward Saxony. Napoleon's reply was silence, then movement. In 8 days his forces crossed the Saale River and outflanked the enemy before they understood he was there. At Jena, he crushed them. Cavalry thundered through fog and smoke, drums beating La Victoire est à nous. At Auerstedt, on the same day, Marshal Davout, outnumbered 2-1, destroyed the Prussian main body. Berlin fell without resistance. Napoleon entered the city on horseback, bareheaded beneath the autumn rain. He visited the tomb of Frederick the Great and said quietly, "If he were alive, we would be friends or enemies worthy of each other." From the Baltic to the Rhine, the old monarchies trembled. Only Russia remained defiant. 2. The frozen battles. The Russian winter swallowed Europe in 1807. Near the town of Eylau, snow fell so thick that muskets misfired. For 2 days, the French and Russian armies tore at each other in a white storm. When the guns fell silent, the field was a wasteland of ice and blood. Napoleon rode among the corpses, his face gray as the sky. He murmured to a general, "Such a victory is almost a defeat." But Russia still withdrew, and at Friedland that summer his skill returned in full fire. The enemy army was driven against the river Alle. The French artillery slaughtered them on the banks. On a raft anchored in mid-river at Tilsit, Napoleon met Tsar Alexander VI. They dined together, young emperors smiling over maps, dividing Europe like schoolboys trading toys. France and Russia became friends. The world believed peace had come. 3. The empire of laws back in Paris. Napoleon ruled not by mercy, but by method. He codified everything: weights, measures, property, marriage, inheritance. The Code Civil, soon called the Napoleonic Code, spread from France to the Netherlands, Italy, Germany, even Poland. He abolished feudal dues, opened careers to talent, built roads and canals that stitched the continent together. To those who feared him, he answered, "Revolution gave Europe ideas. I give it form." He created kings, as others might create generals. Joseph Bonaparte on the throne of Naples, Louis in Holland, Jerome in Westphalia. The Bonapartes multiplied like reflections in a hall of mirrors, each crowned by his will. For 6 years the continent lived to the rhythm of his bulletins. Victory at Jena, Peace of Tilsit, birth of the King of Rome, soon, perhaps. 4. The shadow of Spain. Yet beneath the grandeur, rot began to spread. Spain ally, then pawn became the wound that would never heal. In 1808, Napoleon summoned the Spanish royal family to Bayonne under the pretense of mediation. Within weeks, both father and son had abdicated, and Napoleon placed his brother Joseph on the throne. The Spanish people answered with knives. Priests preached holy war, peasants ambushed convoys, women hurled stones from rooftops. French patrols vanished into the hills. Goya painted their despair, the firing squads, the mutilations. For the first time, Europe saw not liberation, but occupation. Napoleon marched in person, won battles at Burgos and Madrid, but victory turned to sand. Each valley swallowed more men. Each village became an enemy. He left marshals to finish the war, though it would never finish. The word guerrilla, little war, was born there, a whisper of eternal resistance. 5. The Continental Dream. Unable to conquer Britain by arms, Napoleon sought to starve her. The continental system closed every European port to British goods. He imagined an economic empire united by law and blockade, but smuggling thrived. His allies grumbled, his enemies laughed. Factories in France slowed, merchants cursed his name in secret. Still he refused to yield. He reorganized Germany into the Confederation of the Rhine, crowned himself protector of Switzerland, and married politics to geography. Maps were his instruments, rulers were his notes. At his zenith, he governed or influenced over 70 million souls. No one man had ever ruled so much of Europe. Yet the higher the eagle flew, the thinner the air became. 6. Love and loneliness. In the palace of Saint-Cloud, the emperor walked marble corridors alone. Josephine, elegant and adored by Paris, could not give him a son. He loved her, but he loved dynasty more. On a cold December night in 1809, he summoned her to the council chamber. There, surrounded by ministers, she signed the act of divorce with trembling hands. Tears fell on the parchment. Napoleon turned away. "I have no time to weep," he said. Months later, he married Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, child of his old enemies, symbol of legitimacy. When she bore him a son, titled King of Rome, cannon fire thundered across Paris. For one brief moment, the dream seemed complete. A dynasty, an empire, a peace sealed by blood. But in the emperor's eyes there flickered not contentment but fatigue. He had conquered everything except rest. 7. The road to Russia peace never held. The alliance with Russia born of convenience, poisoned by pride, collapsed under the weight of ambition. Alexander refused to obey the continental system. Napoleon accused him of betrayal. In the spring of 1812, the emperor gathered the greatest army the world had ever seen. Over 600,000 men, drawn from every corner of Europe. Drums rolled across the Niemen River as he crossed into Russia. "Soldiers," he proclaimed, "the war we begin will be short and glorious." It was neither. The Russians retreated, burning villages behind them. Heat, dust, and distance consumed the invaders. At Smolensk, flames devoured the city before the French could rest. At Borodino, the bloodiest single day of the age, 70,000 men fell, and nothing was decided. When Napoleon entered Moscow, it was silent. That night, fires rose like torches of defiance. He watched from the Kremlin roof, the city below a sea of flame, and whispered, "What a terrible sight! These are indeed the end of the world." He waited 5 weeks for peace. None came. Winter arrived early. At last he gave the order to retreat. Chew 8. The Long Retreat. Snow began as a whisper and ended as a scream. Men froze standing. Horses collapsed in harness. Wolves followed the columns at night. Discipline dissolved into survival. At the Berezina River, trapped between ice and enemy guns, the remnants built bridges of wagons and corpses. Napoleon stood on the bank, cloak stiff with frost, shouting, "Courage! Soldiers of the great army do not die without glory." When he finally crossed the Niemen again, fewer than 40,000 of the original host remained. The Grand Army was gone devoured by the elements and his own illusion of control. He reached Paris secretly, traveling day and night, carrying with him maps, dispatches, and silence. He entered the Tuileries before dawn. No fanfare, no salute. Only a servant's startled cry. "The Emperor!" Napoleon removed his gloves, looked out at the sleeping city, and said, "From the sublime to the ridiculous, there is but one step." The cracks in the Crown Europe smelled blood. Prussia rose again, Austria wavered, Britain poured gold into every rebellion. In the cafes of Paris, people whispered for the first time that perhaps the Emperor was mortal. Yet he would not rest. He summoned new armies, trained boys to march like veterans, spoke endlessly of honor and destiny. "Fortune," he said, "is a woman. She favors the bold." But fortune was turning her face away. Part 4. The Fall and the Flame, 1813-1815. The snow melted from the Russian plains, revealing bones instead of fields. Across Europe, the silence after catastrophe did not last. Every nation Napoleon had humbled now stirred with vengeance. The eagles that once flew from Madrid to Warsaw limped home, wounded and alone. Yet in Paris, the emperor pretended nothing had changed. He worked 14 hours a day, dictating orders, creating new armies out of ghosts. Maps still covered his tables. Aides still trembled before his voice. But outside the palace windows, France had begun to doubt. 1. The Gathering Storm. In the spring of 1813, Napoleon fielded another army, young conscripts barely trained, their cheeks smooth and their eyes bright with borrowed faith. He called them Les Marie-Louises, after the empress who had blessed their colors. They marched east to meet the Sixth Coalition, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Britain, Sweden, a ring of iron closing around France. At Lutzen and Bautzen he fought like the man of Austerlitz, moving with lightning precision, hurling columns through smoke and rain. The Allies fell back in confusion. Europe gasped that the old fire burned again. But his victories were hollow. Too many officers dead, too few horses, no reserves. Each success cost what he could no longer afford: time, blood, belief. By the summer, Austria turned against him. At Dresden, Napoleon won another dazzling triumph. At Leipzig, 2 months later, his world collapsed. 2. The Battle of Nations, Leipzig, 1813. It began with fog and ended with fire. 500,000 men clashed around Leipzig, cannon roaring like continuous thunder. For 3 days the French held the center, while Allies pressed from every side. On the 4th day, the bridges behind them exploded too soon. Thousands drowned in the Elster River. The Grand Army dissolved. Napoleon stood on a hill, face expressionless, hands clasped behind his back. "Now I know," he said quietly, "what it is to be old." He led the survivors west through rain and mud, harried by cavalry, cheered by none. When he reached the Rhine, France itself felt smaller. 3. The Enemy at the Gates. By 1814, foreign armies marched across French soil. Villages burned in Champagne. Peasants hid in forests, remembering the Revolution's first wars. Napoleon fought on, a general reduced to his purest essence, no longer emperor, only commander. At Montmirail, Château-Thierry, Craonne, he struck swift, local blows, defeating armies twice his size. His genius flared like a dying sun. But the Allies would not stop. They promised the French Senate peace if they would depose him. In Paris, politicians who had once knelt now turned their coats. Even his marshals whispered of surrender. When he learned that the enemy had entered Paris, Napoleon slumped in silence. "Josephine," he murmured, "if only you could see what they are doing to your France." 4. Fontainebleau. On April 6, 1814, he abdicated the throne. In the great hall of Fontainebleau, he said farewell to the old guard. They stood in formation, veterans of every campaign, faces carved by war. Tears ran openly down their cheeks. He stepped onto the staircase, his voice breaking. "Soldiers of my old guard, I bid you farewell. For 20 years I have led you on the path of honor and glory. Be faithful to your new king. Do not forget that I shall follow your deeds. Farewell, my children." He kissed their eagle standard and turned away. Even the hardest men wept. 2 weeks later he sailed into exile, to the tiny island of Elba, a kingdom no larger than a general's map. 5. The Emperor of Elba glittered with sun and salt. Napoleon arrived with a retinue of a few hundred guards, a handful of ships, and an unbroken will. He reorganized the island in weeks, built roads, founded schools, wrote new laws, inspected mines, created a flag of his own, white, with 3 golden bees. But each night, alone on the terrace above the harbor, he looked toward the sea. He listened for rumors from France. The Bourbon king hated. Taxes rising, veterans humiliated. Letters smuggled across the waves told him the truth. The people still whispered his name. One evening in February 1815, he said simply to his aide, "It is time." 6. The Return of the Eagle. A small brig sailed from Elba through a storm. On its deck stood the emperor, wrapped in his grey coat. He landed on the coast of Provence with barely 1,000 men. No banners, no allies, only faith. When royal troops blocked the road near Grenoble, Napoleon advanced alone, unarmed, and called out, "Soldiers, if there is one among you who wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." For a breathless moment, silence. Then muskets dropped. Cries rose. "Vive l'Empereur!" The road to Paris became a pilgrimage. Each garrison joined him. Each village cheered. By the time he reached the capital, the king had fled. On March 20th, 1815, the Tuileries gates opened again. France awoke as if from a dream. The 100 days had begun. 7. The Last Gamble. He moved with his old energy, though his body trembled with pain. Factories roared back to life. Drums beat across the provinces. But Europe was already united against him, the Seventh Coalition, sworn to end the nightmare forever. Napoleon chose to strike first. In June 1815, he marched into Belgium, hoping to split the British under Wellington and the Prussians under Blücher. At Ligny, he won narrowly. At Quatre Bras, his marshals hesitated. And then, on June 18th, the fields near the village of Waterloo turned to mud under cold rain. Waterloo morning. Cannon smoke drifted like low clouds. The emperor stood beside his horse, spyglass in hand, his face pale, eyes distant. Illness gnawed at him. Fortune no longer answered. At 11 o'clock he began the assault. Columns advanced through musket fire. Cuirassiers charged up the ridge toward British squares. They broke, reformed, broke again. By afternoon the Prussians arrived, black banners glinting through the storm. Napoleon threw in his final reserve, the Imperial Guard, veterans of Austerlitz and Jena. They marched silently, drums beating slow, the last heartbeat of an empire. "La Garde recule," someone cried. "The Guard is retreating." "No!" shouted another officer. "The Guard dies but does not surrender." But the truth was undeniable. The Guard died, and the empire with it. At dusk, Napoleon rode from the field through a rain of ash and rain. He whispered, "All is lost but honor." 9. Surrender. He reached Paris to find the city silent. The chambers of government refused him. Even his generals begged him to abdicate again. On June 22nd he did so, naming his son Napoleon II, a crown for a child who would never wear it. Then he sought refuge with the British, hoping for asylum in England. At Rochefort he boarded the frigate Bellerophon and surrendered to Captain Maitland. "I come," he said, "like Themistocles, to the hospitality of the British people. I throw myself upon their generosity." They received him with courtesy and sent him far away. 10. The end of the road. The ship crossed the equator, bound for a lonely rock in the South Atlantic, St. Helena. There would be no escape this time, no army, no map, only sea and sky. As the coast of France faded from view, Napoleon stood on deck, silent. He took off his hat and whispered, "Adieu, France, adieu." The horizon swallowed the last glimmer of Europe. Part 5, The Immortal Shadow, 1815, 1821 and beyond. The ship that carried him south moved through endless water, each day hotter, emptier, farther from everything that had once mattered. The sea stretched without mercy. The sky turned from blue to white. For Napoleon Bonaparte, conqueror of Europe, the voyage to St. Helena was less a journey than a slow erasure. He walked the deck each morning, coat buttoned against the wind, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Officers avoided his gaze. Even the gulls that followed the ship seemed to tire and vanish. At last, after 2 months, a jagged outline rose from the mist. A black rock in a silver sea. St. Helena. The end of the world. 1. Longwood. His new palace was a damp house on a windswept plateau. Rain dripped through the roof. Mold crept along the walls. The British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, enforced every petty rule. No correspondence without inspection, no visitor unmonitored, no walk beyond 2 miles without escort. Napoleon accepted it outwardly, but inside him the fire still lived. He turned routine into ritual. Each morning he rose before dawn, shaved carefully, dressed in his grey coat and white breeches as if for parade, then dictated letters and memoirs until noon. He inspected his small garden, corrected maps, debated politics with his few companions. "History," he said, "is the version of past events that people have decided to agree upon. I shall give them my version." He walked the narrow paths, hands behind his back, boots crunching the gravel. The wind carried the smell of sea and decay. Sometimes he paused to watch the clouds, as though commanding invisible armies across the sky. 2. The circle of exiles around him gathered a tiny court of loyalty and sorrow. Bertrand, Montholon, Courgot, the faithful valet Marchand, and a handful of servants who still called him sire. They argued, gossiped, remembered. At night they read aloud from Homer, Ossian, Voltaire. When thunder rolled, he smiled. "The guns of Austerlitz still salute me." The British sent visitors, admirals, scientists, curious travelers, who came to see the monster and left subdued. He greeted them with calm courtesy, speaking of geography, law, and the nature of ambition. Some expected madness. They found melancholy reason. One officer wrote home, "He lives as if the universe were a map upon his table, and time itself awaited his orders." 3. Echoes of Empire. Even in exile he governed memory. He organized his papers, dictated memoirs that turned defeats into lessons, betrayals into inevitabilities. He spoke endlessly of the revolution, of destiny, of France. "Everything I have done," he said, "was to close the gulf between the people and power. I built upon reason. They destroyed through fear." At times he laughed, short, bitter, almost tender. "I wanted to found a dynasty of ideas," he mused. But ideas are harder to inherit than crowns. News from Europe reached him months late. Marie-Louise remarried. His son, the King of Rome, now lived under another name in Vienna. The boy's tutors forbade him to speak French. Napoleon read the letter twice, then folded it carefully. "Empires die faster than children forget," he murmured. 4. Dreams and fevers. The island's climate gnawed at him. He grew heavier, coughed blood, slept little. Some night servants found him pacing the veranda beneath moonlight, muttering to invisible marshals, reliving the maneuvers of Austerlitz or Wagram. "Move Davout to the left," he whispered. "Hold the heights. Now, strike." Then he would stop, breathless, staring into the darkness. "The enemy never rests," he told Marchand once. "Even here." He dreamed of France, fields, bells, the smell of powder after rain. He awoke one morning certain he had heard cannon from the sea. "There is always a battle somewhere," he said. "Perhaps they still fight for me." But the world had moved on. The monarchs who feared him now signed treaties, married cousins, and congratulated themselves on peace. Europe had returned to sleep. 5. The final days by 1821 his health failed entirely. Stomach pain tore through him. Food turned to bitterness. He knew the disease. His father had died of the same. He joked weakly. "Even death must obey my family tradition." The last weeks blurred into wind and fever. He dictated fragments of his will, gifts for servants, requests for autopsy, and one line for the ages: "I wish my ashes to rest on the banks of the Seine, among the French people whom I have loved so much." On May 5th, the sky darkened with storm. Rain struck the shutters like musket fire. Napoleon lay beneath a green baize canopy, attended by priests and soldiers who once commanded empires. He whispered, "France, army, Josephine." Then the hand that had traced Europe's borders fell still. Outside, thunder rolled across the sea. It was 6 o'clock in the evening. The emperor was dead. 6. Aftermath. They buried him the next day in a valley he had chosen himself, the Valley of the Willows. A simple stone, a few evergreens, the roar of the ocean. No name carved upon the tomb. Yet far away, in every capital of Europe, people felt a strange emptiness, as if some great clock had stopped. Enemies remembered his courage, friends his will. Even those who had cursed him whispered prayers. Years passed. In 1840, the French government asked that his remains be returned. A ship, La Belle Poule, sailed through storm and sunlight to bring him home. As it entered the Seine, crowds lined the banks for miles. Old soldiers wept, school children shouted, "Vive l'Empereur!" The coffin was carried beneath the Arc de Triomphe and laid in the crypt of Les Invalides. Drums rolled, cannon thundered, snow fell gently like blessing. At last, the wanderer had come home. 7. The shadow that remained, death had purified him. What in life was fear now became fascination. Poets called him Prometheus, fallen angel, Titan chained by fate. Painters covered salons with his image, alone on cliffs, beneath storm skies, or crowned in impossible light. To the poor he was hope, to kings, warning, to dreamers, temptation. Every revolution that followed carried a trace of his silhouette. His laws outlived his empire, his name became shorthand for genius and ruin. The British historian Macaulay wrote, "He left the world different from what he found it." The French simply said, "He is France." 8. Epilogue. The eternal march walk today, beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides, and you will feel the hush. The marble floor gleams like still water. The red sarcophagus glows under a circle of light. Tourists speak in whispers. Time itself seems to halt. Engraved around the walls are names of victories: Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, Rivoli, each a heartbeat that refuses to fade. Above, angels of victory guard his rest, their faces calm as dawn. Outside, Paris hums, streets full of motion, laws still shaped by his hand, citizens walking unknowingly in his design. And somewhere beyond the noise, perhaps in the restless sea wind, the echo lingers. Glory is fleeting, but obscurity is forever. Chapter 9. Legacy. What was he in the end? Monster or genius, savior or destroyer? History still debates, as though the verdict could change him. He was all of it: pride and order, cruelty and vision. The human will raised to lightning and then shattered by its own brilliance. He proved that one man could redraw the world through imagination and discipline, and that even such a man cannot escape time. He began as a whisper of rebellion in a Corsican cradle. He ended as a legend larger than any throne, and in every age since, whenever ambition looks toward the impossible, his shadow lengthens again across the map. The city of Paris glittered beneath a winter sun. Bells tolled across the Seine, their echoes mingling with the murmurs of 1,000 voices gathered outside the cathedral of Notre Dame. Inside, under a vault of golden light and incense smoke, Napoleon Bonaparte, once a nameless Corsican boy, stood before the altar in a robe of crimson velvet. Pope Pius VII waited with the crown of France in his trembling hands. The ceremony was a masterpiece of theater, designed to sanctify power and erase doubt. But Napoleon, who bowed to no one, took the crown himself. Slowly, deliberately, he placed it upon his own head. The gesture was both defiance and destiny. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause, and the organ roared as if the heavens themselves had surrendered. At that moment, Napoleon was not a general, nor a politician. He was an idea, the embodiment of ambition made flesh. He had seized power not by birthright, but by will. And now, before the world and the church, he crowned himself Emperor of the French. The empire awakens, Europe trembled. Monarchs whispered his name with unease, as though it were a spell that could summon storms. From the frozen plains of Poland to the marble palaces of Vienna, kings and emperors gathered armies to crush the upstart from Corsica. Napoleon answered with movement. His Grande Armée was unlike any force the world had seen. Disciplined, loyal, and built in his image. They called themselves Children of the Emperor. They marched with songs on their lips and eagles on their banners, believing themselves invincible. Each campaign was a symphony of speed and deception. Napoleon's genius lay not in brute strength but in rhythm, the rhythm of arrival, surprise, encirclement. He moved like a shadow through Europe, unseen until the final blow. The Thunder at Austerlitz, 1805. It was dawn in December, and the fields of Moravia lay wrapped in mist. The Austrians and Russians had joined forces to destroy Napoleon once and for all. Outnumbered and outgunned, the emperor appeared vulnerable, even reckless. He wanted them to think so. When his marshals protested the weakness of the right flank, Napoleon only smiled. "You will see," he said. "I shall play with them, as a cat plays with mice." The battle began under a pale sun. Allied troops advanced through fog, confident of an easy victory. They didn't know that Napoleon's army waited hidden behind the hills, ready to strike. Then, with a signal, a lift of the emperor's hand, the trap snapped shut. French columns burst from the mist, climbing the Pratzen heights like a tide of steel. Cannon smoke rolled across the valley. The sun broke through the clouds, shining directly into the faces of the stunned Allied troops. By noon, the field was chaos. Men fought knee-deep in blood and ice. The enemy's center collapsed, their lines shattered. Thousands drowned trying to flee across frozen lakes, as French artillery thundered from above. By nightfall, the three emperors' battle, Napoleon, Alexander, and Francis, was over. Only one remained victorious. Napoleon rode through the ruins, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and wet earth. He turned to his generals and said quietly, "This day will live forever." And it did. On the master of Europe after Austerlitz, Europe bowed. Austria signed peace. Prussia trembled. Russia withdrew. France, once a republic bleeding from revolution, now stood at the center of an empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Vistula. Paris became the heart of the world, a capital of art, science, and power. Roads, laws, and reforms spread like veins from its center. Even Napoleon's enemies admitted that his civil code would outlive his conquests. Yet beneath the grandeur, something darker stirred. The emperor who had conquered Europe could not conquer himself. He hungered for perfection, feared stagnation, and distrusted rest. He once told Josephine, his empress and his love, "Power is my mistress. I have worked too hard to win her to let her slip away." But power is a cruel companion. The Spanish Nightmare. In 1808, Napoleon made a decision that would stain his empire forever. He sought to replace the Spanish king with his own brother Joseph. It was meant to be simple, a political adjustment on the chessboard of Europe. Instead, it became a firestorm. Spain rose in rebellion. Priests preached holy war. Farmers turned into guerrillas. Every road, every village became a battlefield. French columns were ambushed, mutilated, hunted like invaders from hell. The war was not of armies, but of vengeance, and it changed everything. For the first time, Napoleon faced an enemy that refused to play by his rules. He won battles but lost a nation. The word guerrilla, little war, was born in Spain, and it would haunt empires for centuries. The fatal march east. But the emperor's gaze had already turned elsewhere, toward the endless horizon of Russia. He saw the Tsar's half-kept promises, the fragile alliance, the shifting loyalties. He convinced himself that one more war would end all wars. In June 1812, he crossed the Niemen River with over 600,000 men, the largest army the world had ever seen. It was not an invasion, it was an exodus. Soldiers from every corner of Europe marched beneath the French eagle. The rivers glowed red beneath sunsets that lasted forever. Villages burned, fields vanished into dust. The Russians retreated deeper into their vast homeland, refusing battle. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, the city was empty, silent, ghostly. And then, in the night, it burned. The flames devoured the ancient capital. The emperor watched from the Kremlin, the fire reflected in his eyes. He whispered, "The Russians have chosen to destroy their own city rather than surrender." It was not triumph he felt. It was dread. Winter came early. Snow fell thick as ash. Horses froze where they stood. Men burned their muskets for warmth. Hunger replaced glory. By the time the army stumbled back across the Niemen, fewer than 40,000 survived. The rest were gone, swallowed by frost, distance, and silence. The emperor returned to Paris, not as a conqueror, but as a ghost. The fall of the eagle defeat breeds defiance. One by one, Europe's old enemies rose again. Prussia, Austria, Britain, Russia, united in vengeance. In 1814, their armies closed around Paris. The city that had crowned him emperor now wept beneath the roar of cannons. Napoleon's marshals begged him to surrender. He looked at them, men who had followed him across deserts and snow, and said only, "If I cannot be your emperor, I will be your general." But it was over. He abdicated the throne and was sent into exile on the tiny island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. For the first time, the world was free of him, and yet, without him, it felt strangely empty. The 100 Days. But fate had not finished its game. In February 1815, a rumor spread across Europe. The emperor has escaped. From Elba, Napoleon sailed with a few hundred loyal men. When royal troops confronted him on the road to Paris, he stepped forward alone and opened his coat. "If there is one among you who wishes to kill his emperor," he said, "here I am." No one fired. The soldiers cheered. The legend had returned. For 100 days, the eagle flew again. France trembled with old glory. Armies gathered. Flags rose. Europe held its breath. Then, on June 18, 1815, at a small Belgian village called Waterloo, destiny waited. Waterloo rain fell over the muddy fields. Napoleon, ill and weary, surveyed the enemy through his telescope. The British under Wellington stood on the ridge, silent and immovable. The Prussians were on the march. The battle began with thunder. Cannons roared. Cavalry charged. The field turned into a storm of mud and blood. For hours the French assaults crashed against British lines, brave, relentless, futile. When the Prussians arrived in the late afternoon, it was the end. Napoleon watched as his guard, the last proud remnant of his empire, was surrounded. Someone shouted, "La garde recule!" "The guard is retreating." "No," another voice cried, "the guard dies but does not surrender." But even legends must yield to time. As night fell, Napoleon's empire shattered once more. Of the long exile. He surrendered to the British and was sent far beyond the reach of Europe, to a lonely island in the South Atlantic called St. Helena. There, among the wind and waves, he lived his final years in reflection. He walked the same narrow paths each day, watched ships that never came, dictated his memoirs to loyal companions. Sometimes, when the sea was calm, he would speak softly. "I closed the gates of anarchy and opened those of order. What have they done with France since?" He grew frail, but his mind burned as bright as ever. He spoke of Austerlitz, of Moscow, of destiny, as if reliving a dream that would not fade. On May 5, 1821, as a storm gathered over the Atlantic, Napoleon Bonaparte took his final breath. His last words were whispered in the dim light. "France, the army, Josephine." Outside, the wind howled across the cliffs. The emperor was gone. But the sea, restless and eternal, still whispered his name. The island of St. Helena sank back into silence after the funeral. The surf sighed against the rocks. The wind carried no banners, no drums, only the cry of distant gulls. A handful of officers lowered the coffin into the earth, a plain wooden box painted black. No crown, no throne, just the sea. Yet even as the grave was filled, something stirred far beyond that lonely shore. History itself refused to let him rest. For the rumor of resurrection. The first whispers came within weeks. Sailors returning from the Atlantic swore that the emperor was not dead, that he had escaped again, that he was gathering ships in the fog to reclaim his crown. In Paris, children played at being little corporal, and veterans lifted their glasses in secret toasts. À l'empereur. The Bourbons ruled, but their rule felt borrowed. Every soldier still kept a folded scrap of blue cloth hidden in his drawer, a piece of uniform, a memory of glory. The world had learned a strange truth. An empire can fall in a day, but an idea does not die. The Pilgrimage of Memory. 2 decades passed. Europe changed. Kings died. Borders shifted. But Napoleon's shadow remained. In 1840, the French government, eager to heal old wounds, petitioned Britain to return his body. A British frigate sailed south through storms and brought the coffin home. When the ship reached the Seine, crowds filled the banks for miles. Old soldiers wept openly. Mothers lifted their children to see. Paris rang again with the sound of marching drums, though the man they honored lay still. The coffin was carried through the Arc de Triomphe beneath banners of violet and gold. Snow fell softly as it passed. not a blizzard, but a benediction. Inside the dome of Les Invalides, under a circle of cold light, the emperor was laid to rest for the second time, this time in marble and immortality. The cult of the emperor. From that moment, Napoleon was no longer merely a man of history. He became a religion of sorts, half hero, half ghost. Poets wrote of him as a fallen angel. Painters bathed him in light and shadow, standing alone on cliffs or beneath vast skies. Victor Hugo called him the man of destiny, whose footprints were the shape of Europe. His hat, his grey coat, even the tilt of his telescope became symbols. Shorthand for will, genius, and the tragedy of greatness. Children studied his campaigns as scripture. Politicians quoted him. Generals, decades later, still planned battles as if asking, what would Napoleon do? Echoes through centuries. The 19th century gave birth to imitators and dreamers, men who tried to wear his mantle and failed. But the image of Napoleon outlived them all. He appeared again in music, in novels, in whispers of revolution. When the Second Empire rose under his nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the world gasped, as if the shadow had taken flesh once more. Even his enemies could not escape him. British historians studied him to understand power. Russian writers used him as a mirror of human pride. In every age since, his name reappeared whenever ambition met fate. From the trenches of the First World War to the halls of modern politics, the same questions echoed. Where does genius end and madness begin? When does leadership become tyranny? When does will become destiny? Napoleon had become not a person, but a parable. The island in the mind. On St. Helena today, the sea still whispers around the black rocks. Visitors climb the hill to the empty tomb. His remains now rest in Paris. But the island feels haunted by thought itself. The wind carries phrases that seem almost words. Empire, glory, France. A small plaque reads, "Here lies Napoleon." But that is not true. He lies everywhere, in history books, in dreams, in the very language of ambition. Every leader who studies a map, every soldier who believes one man can change the world, walks in his shadow. The eternal sleep in the museum beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides. The sarcophagus glows under gentle light. Tourists move quietly, their footsteps softened by the marble floor. They look down, not in fear, but in awe. The air feels heavy, not with death, but with memory. Above the tomb are carved his victories. Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram. Around it, angels of victory guard his rest. And still, outside, Paris hums. The living city built on his reforms, his codes, his vision of order. Time, the one enemy he could never defeat, has done him an odd kindness. It has made him immortal. Bis, Jepilogue. The shadow that teaches history will forever argue about him. Was he hero or tyrant? Genius or monster? Perhaps both. Perhaps that is what greatness truly is. The tension between light and darkness within a single soul. He rose from nothing, burned like a star, and vanished into the sea. But even stars, when they die, leave light that travels forever. So, too, does his. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who taught the world that ambition is both a flame and a wound. The man who crowned himself, lost his empire, and conquered time itself. And somewhere, on some eternal battlefield of memory, he still stands beneath the rising sun of Austerlitz, his hand tucked into his coat, his gaze fixed on horizons no map can hold.